Mr. Knowles, I want to ask you the question that you aren't going to get asked by Mr. Polumbo because you're debating him rather than Ms. McCloskey. People report, and you disagree, that they have a different anthropology than you. They don't agree with your description of the soul. And what they say is, I see my child, I see them light up when they get to dress in the way they want. I see them feel more comfortable. Even aside from those longer term questions, how can I as a parent be so sure when you tell me that when I see my child feel more comfortable, they're wrong and I'm wrong, when in anything else, if they signed up for Little League and it really fit for them, I would go with it, I would explore it. And your answer here is not. So how do you answer that sense of a parent's sense of their own child and that particular child's response to a transgender feeling?
I think this point by the phantom of Professor McCloskey is a very good one, because it would seem to me that what transgenderism is proposing is an anthropology. It's an idea about what human nature is. And so if it is true, then it is true for children, and I'm not using this to suggest we get rid of transing the kids. Ultimately, I think that, of course. But if it's true, then it would seem to me very cruel to prevent a child from transitioning, especially before puberty. Because if you can suppress a child's puberty, and then you can put them on cross-sex hormones, and then you can have the little boy look more like a little girl, he is going to much more successfully pass as the opposite sex than if he were to be put on these kinds of hormones and have these procedures much later. It would be much more expensive, it would be much more painful. And so if transgenderism is true, then I think we have to trans the kids. Now, it so happens that transgenderism is not true, and there are people who are in all various states of anxiety and depression and even who have fallen into this of transgenderism later on. And so just as I think it would be wrong to lead children who are behaving in an irrational way down this path, I think it would be quite wrong to do that to adults as well. Mr. Polumbo has conceded the point that at the extremes of anorexia, it would be fine to force feed somebody or force somebody into hospitalization. Mr. Polumbo has made the point that someone suffering body identity disorder would not be able to get this sort of a surgery to remove a limb. What doctor in his right mind would do it? I will point out there are doctors today removing the healthy breasts of 14-year-old girls, so I think you can find a lot of quacks out there. In fact, there have been quacks who have performed this surgery, but none of us, I think, believes that we ought to chop off the healthy limbs of these very people. So I just don't see why we wouldn't apply that down the line. Professor McCloskey's position is a consistent position, and it's consistently wrong. And I think that if we're going to be right here, we have to be consistently right. To Brad's point that he keeps saying, why would you want the government to do this? Why would you trust the government? I've said it before, I suppose I'll say it again. In the United States, we are the government. Even with all the corruption, we are the government. And if we surrender our capacity for reason and moral conscience, if we really say that we can't know the difference between true and false and right and wrong, then we're surrendering self-government. This is what John Adams meant when he said the Constitution's built for a moral and religious people. That wasn't soft soap and a nice platitude. He's saying that's how self-government works. If we surrender that, we lose the American project.
Mr. Polumbo, I do want to ask you the same question. What would you say to a parent who says, I want to take care of my child, everything I see in my child's behavior, not just in what they tell me, but in the way they act when I address them in one way or the other, when I put them with one group of kids or the other, tells me they're happier this way and uncomfortable the other, but you say I can't do this till they're 18. Why?
Well, to clarify, I'm okay with them socially transitioning.
But I think you know that that's not always where people want to stop.
I agree.
Right? So what would you say to that parent?
The reason that is not appropriate is that child is too young to really consent to the life-altering possibilities of that, but two, going through puberty of your natal sex. We okay?
Some people were transitioning to the front rows, and so I think the security got a little worried about that.
Okay. I'll just start over.
So again, I'd like to ask the question again, because I think the reason the noises are so loud out there and the reason everyone got quiet when we saw someone moving is that people think the stakes of this question are high.
They are.
And that parents worry if they listen to you, Mr. Polumbo, and wait and act later, they may not be taking care of their child or loving their child as they are. And it sounds like you're all right with them doing that later, but not earlier. And I think that's a big burden of proof for that question.
I understand completely, and that's why I think this is a really complicated issue. I don't envy a parent who has a child with severe gender dysphoria. I can see why they would be incredibly torn on what the right thing to do is. But what I will say is that it's actually the process of going through puberty as your natal sex that often causes gender incongruity to desist. So the problem is that now they go on puberty blockers, then they do cross-sex hormones. They never actually go, that's why previously, decades ago, when you had gender incongruent youth, many of them grew up to be gay men or lesbian women. And that was because when they went through their puberty, they reconciled their gender. They realized the things they were feeling didn't mean they were actually
Is there
trapped
a
in
point
the wrong
after
body.
a certain trial of puberty where you'd feel comfortable with a minor transitioning when they say, I've given it a good shot, Mr. Polumbo, like you said this works for some people, it doesn't work for me?
That's why it's so hard to have the government come in and set a one-size-fits-all rule. I have also said that, I think the age of consent should be 18, but in some states it's 16 or 17. It would make sense to me then that in those states you could also transition gender at 16 or 17. But I don't know exactly where to draw the line. And that's part of my point here, is that Michael keeps saying transgenderism is false. And if it is false, it should be banned. I don't believe the government should be in the business of banning false ideas. Michael's also said that transgenderism is a false religion. So then we want to ban religions. I'm wondering what happened to freedom of religion? What happened to freedom of speech? And also, the average federal bureaucrat has the politics of Elizabeth Warren. And I know you can cite noble things about self-government, but the truth is we have a bloated bureaucracy that does not represent the American people. It is an entrenched political class with politics much different than yours. So the idea that we're going to make that government the arbiter of what ideas are true and false and ban or eradicate some ideas as a result of that seems to me not just a bad idea on principle, but incredibly short-sighted for people from your background and worldview and values.
Mr. Knowles, how do you think you would fare under a government that has the reach and intimacy that you are advocating for?
I think I would fare fairly well because, while I agree with Brad's point that we have far too many bureaucrats on the federal payroll, the recent upending of laws concerning sex and gender have come from elected and appointed officials. It's come from the Supreme Court, appointed by presidents. It's come from legislators in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all over the country. So it has been from representatives of the people and appointed officials who've been appointed by representatives of the people, and the people change their minds. That's one of the features of democracy. And so, unfortunately, the Supreme Court in 1973 decided that there were some imaginary right to abortion, and this error persisted for a long time. And then 49 years later, the court reversed that decision. In 2020, the Supreme Court made an error and decided to interpret civil rights law protections for sex as being protections for sexual orientation and gender identity, which ironically undermines civil rights protections for sex by allowing the men to play on the sports teams and go to the bathrooms. And so in this case, I know, Brad, you keep suggesting that I want this very narrow, authoritarian, totalitarian view. I don't. There are all sorts of questions where I'm happy to leave things pretty open. But on certain issues where only one side can establish its principle in society, we have to come to conclusions. And I would come to the conclusion that has prevailed for all of human history, not the one that cropped up 5 seconds ago.